Hello everyone, welcome to the course of Survey of Major English-Speaking Countries. Today, we're going to learn Chapter 13, American Literature. This lecture is about Lesson A, the Transcendentalism in American Literature. From the beginning of American history to the present day, American literature has recorded the story of exploring and questing. At different times, the quest had taken different forms. In the 16th century, Europeans came to the New World in search of the lost continent of Atlantis. They came looking for the golden cities of Cibola that haunted Spanish adventurer Coronado's imagination. At times, the quest was a religious pilgrim. For example, the Puritan hoped the New World would become a new paradise, where a chosen people might at last build a society of which God would approve. The Mormons, who traveled across the plains to Utah, were inspired by a similar vision. These fantastic dreams changed in time to more down-to-earth dreams of success. These dreams brought millions of young men and women from farms and small towns to cities in the hope of winning fame and fortune. Other pioneers were pulled westward, either by financial or religious ambitions. They were simply restless. Whether they traveled by covered wagon or by recreational vehicles, they believed that being on the road was better than staying put. The question of the American people has indeed been a drama of many parts. In one way or another, however, it has always been a pursuit of happiness. American literature, in one sense, is the continuous narrative of that pursuit. The country was expanding westward. But in the older cities of the northwestern states, which still was referred to as New England, the influence of early Puritan teachings remained strong. However, such authoritarian religious organizations inevitably produced dissenters. As a new idea against intellectualism, Transcendentalism arose in New England, sharing the Romantic characters. The importance of institution, the exaltation of the individual over society, the new and thrilling delight in nature, fascination with the Gothic and Oriental, and desire to build a national literature and culture, Transcendentalism, as a way of knowing the world and nature, believes that individuals can intuitively receive higher truth, otherwise unavailable through common methods of knowing. More specifically, the visible world offers endless clues about the invisible world, whose truths stand eternally behind the factual world perceived by the senses. Translated into literature, this belief became an emphasis on symbolic representation. As formulated by Ralph Waldo Emerson, this became a call for action, encouraging the young not to be enslaved by customs, but to follow the God within, and to live every moment with diligence and efforts. However, insofar as nature is believed to be the morally good, proving God's presence everywhere in His creation, and that human nature is accordingly all good, they believe that society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were two of the most famous and influential transcendentalists. Emerson was born in Boston, a descendant from a line of preacher ancestors. When he was 8, his father died, The whole family suddenly found themselves in difficult economic conditions. Yet, Emerson, like his three brothers, still struggled to stay in school. Emerson read broadly, and his reading list included various works, from Greek works to Roman, from west to east. Graduating from Harvard in 1821, he set out to become a minister. After traveling in Europe and England, where he met Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and other Romantic writers, he came back and settled in Concord, Massachusetts, where he took up the life of an essayist, poet, and public speaker. What he preached was optimism, self-reliance, and the infinite potentials of an individual. In 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson published a startling book called Nature. In this volume, Emerson claims that by studying and responding to nature, individuals could reach a higher spiritual state without formal religion. For the next several years, Emerson's essays made him extremely influential, not only upon other thinkers and writers, but upon the general population as well, thanks to growing popular lecture circuits that brought controversial speakers to small towns across the country. In effect, Emerson's lectures were like religious sermons with their direct, motivating language. In his poetry, Emerson developed a free-form, natural style, using symbols and imagery drawn from nature. His works had an immense impact on other poets of the time. The power of Emerson comes not only from his ideas, but also from the eloquence with which he could express his ideas. He is certainly the most quotable American writer. In the technically more exact sense, Emerson's form is lecture. Or rather, Emerson's inspiring lecture is a kind of prose poetry. His eloquence testifies to his concept of the organic art, namely, inspired poet spoke with a force from his own deepest being that is connected to the universal mind. When Emerson spoke as the inspired, he sometimes forgot to bring the audience with him to the height he reached. So, some of his lectures were like grand houses in which the architect had forgotten to build stairs. Passion alone, of course, does not sufficiently account for Emerson's style. He served as a cultural middleman. Through him, the aesthetic and philosophical currents of Europe passed America, and he led his countrymen during the literary glory known as the American Renaissance. As a principal spokesman for transcendentalism, the American romanticist Emerson gave direction to a religious, philosophical, and literary movement that stressed a belief in the spiritual potential of every person. A circle of intellectuals who were discontented with the New England establishment soon gathered around Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were known as the Transcendentalists, based on their acceptance of Emerson's theories about spiritual transcendence. One of Emerson's most gifted fellow thinkers was Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was passionate not only about individuals learning to think for themselves and being independent, both traditional American values, but also about the necessity for humans to live simply and to know and care for the place where they lived. In 1845, Thoreau built a small cabin for himself on Weldon Pond to carry out his ideals. He spent more than 2 years there. seeking a simpler type of life. He lived alone with only the company of natural creatures and the neighboring farmers. He experimented with working as little as possible, rather than engaging the pattern of 6 days on with 1 day off. Sometimes, Sorrel worked as a land surveyor or in the pencil factory. He felt that this new approach helped him avoid the misery he saw around him. The mass of men led lives of quiet desperation, Sorrel once wrote. His schedule gave him plenty of time to devote to his philosophical and literary interests. Sorrel eventually started writing about his Walden Pond experiment as well. Many were curious about his revolutionary lifestyle, and this interest provided the creative spark for a collection of essays. Published in 1854, Walden, or Life in the Woods, described living a life close to nature. This book recorded his daily observation of the changing seasons and his conviction that living in close relation to nature is personally liberating. This book was a modest success, but it wasn't until much later that this book reached a larger audience. Over the years, Walden has inspired and informed the work of naturalists, environmentalists, and many other writers. While living at Walden Pond, Sorrel also had an encounter with the law. He spent a night in jail after refusing to pay tax. This experience led him to write one of his best-known and most influential essays, Civil Disobedience. Sorrel held deeply his own political views, opposing slavery and the Mexican-American War. He made a strong case for acting on one's individual conscience and not blindly follow laws and government policy. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right, he wrote. Since its publication in 1849, Civil Disobedience has inspired many leaders of protest movements around the world. This non-violent approach to political and social resistance has influenced American civil rights movements activist Martin Luther King Jr. and Indian leader Gandhi, who helped India win independence from Great Britain. Transcendentalism is, in many aspects, the first notable American intellectual movement. It has inspired succeeding generations of American intellectuals, as well as many literary movements. In addition to the theme of American democracy, Transcendentalism literature also promotes the idea of nature as divine and the human soul as the inner wise. Transcendentalism also had a political dimension, and writers such as Sorrel put their beliefs into action through civil disobedience to the government. The 19th century was a new age, beginning with the hope and the promise of democracy, and the development of an American identity, and moving towards mass devastation and division by the middle of the century. Slavery and the Civil War, growing industrialization and the class division, all these events were influential, and each had a role to play in the Transcendentalism movement.